Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen auf Regens video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 19 of my organisational series. In this case I'll be attempting to provide an overview of the structure and development of the Russian tank corps in World War II. Additional background information concerning why I created this video and the reasons I selected the structure I did can be found in my previous video, which is part 18 and covers the German Panzer Division. There's no need to process or view this information to view the rest of this video, but if you're interested, please look at part 18 before you go ahead with this, or even after this version of the video. The main focus of these videos is the battalion, as once I go down to a company level, the TIEL would be significantly longer and more complex, and the video would be probably 4 hours long instead of 30 minutes long. I may come back and break down battalions to company level, but certainly not in this video. I'll start off with a very simple key. Additional information can be found in my previous part of this video, the German Panzer Division 1, but a quick run through. First, we have the typical division in the specific period I'm covering. In this case, we can see it's the 1st Tank Corps on the 31st of March 1942. This is indicated at the top of the chart. Next level of command is the brigade or equivalent. This is indicated with the red lines. The number of brigades in this formation is indicated, as is its combat strength. The third formation level is the battalion or equivalent. The number of each battalion is indicated, as in this case we can see 2 tank battalions. Moving to the right, we come to the battalion combat strength, in this case 530, followed by a battalion code, which in this case is MT2, which means medium tank strength 2, and finally a combat value, which is used for a set of rules based on SPI Modern Battles board game. This value, that is the board game value, will be ignored in this video as it's used for a set of figure gaming rules, but the other values will be used as they provide an idea of the battalion type and strength. In front of the battalion name is a mobility symbol, which could be motorised, mot, as you can see here, horse, cycle, armoured, and so on. If there's no symbol, it means it's on foot. For some of the battalions, an idea of the weapon within is provided. In this case, it's a battalion which consists of 76mm guns. Above this entry, you'll see a mixed 82mm and 122mm mortar battalion, and above this a 37mm AA gun. Now let's drill down into combat strengths or combat values. This is a points value, or the points value of that formation, using a rather old set of figure gaming rules, in this case Corps Commander. I could have used any set of rules, and while the results would vary a little bit, I found they are all generally similar. Of course, how close these points values reflect reality is another issue, which in this video I will not be covering. In the point system, no provision for a formation's morale or quality is taken into account. Thus, a German 1941 Panzer battalion would have a significant advantage over a Soviet tank battalion in 1941 due to quality. But trying to factor those subjective issues in is so difficult, it would make my analysis comparatively useless because it would be basically my gut feel. Viewers will need to take quality and morale factors into account if they wish to compare the strength of one nationality against another. That will not be covered in this video. Even within the same nationalities, the troop qualities of a 1941 Panzer battalion would be higher than a 1939 or 1945 Panzer battalion. Viewers will need to make their own subjective call if they wish to perform such a chronological comparison. Let's now go to the nitty-gritty of the video, the analysis portion, starting with 1941 and specifically the German invasion of Russia. While the Russians did possess a type of tank corps back in 1939, this was short-lived, and I will bypass this formation for this video. In 1941, the Russians deployed tank and mechanised divisions rather than corps. I'll start with the tank division in this analysis, as it's interesting to compare this formation with the latter tank corps. The Russians used this formation, the divisional formations, in various forms until the end of 1941, but it was quickly decided to not form new divisions after the German invasion, and this formation structure became a dead end and fell by the wayside. This table shows the 34th Tank Division in June 1941. The division consisted of an artillery regiment, motorised infantry regiment, medium tank regiment and a light tank regiment. At the divisional level, there was a reconnaissance and anti-aircraft battalion. There was some variability in this structure. Drilling down to the regiments in more detail, the artillery regiment, which was fully motorised, consisted of one light artillery battalion consisting of 76mm guns and a medium howitzer battalion consisting of 122mm howitzers. For a divisional size formation, this was rather light in terms of artillery, but does compare with, let's say, the German Light Division in 1939. The motorised infantry regiment consisted of 3 motorised infantry battalions with some minimal regimental support formations. This specific division contained the 67th Medium Tank Regiment, which consisted of 3 medium tank battalions, generally equipped with BT equivalent tanks. Some of the divisions possessed heavy tank battalions, which were equipped with KV tanks. This caused the Germans massive issues in the northern sector of the front line. The final regiment was the 68th Light Tank Regiment, consisting of 3 light tank battalions, and of course equipped with a wide variety of different Russian light tanks. During the bulk of 1941 and even into the early periods of 1942, apart from the surviving remnants of the tank divisions, the Russians only formed tank brigades. But in March 1942, they once again attempted to form a divisional-sized tank formation, the Tank Corps. These were initially very simple, consisting of existing brigades which were simply banded together under a single HQ structure. When the first Tank Corps was formed in March 1942, it was little more than 3 brigades combined under a single command. You can see that corps assets were non-existent, as was any form of corps-level artillery support or formations. The corps consisted of a single motorised infantry brigade. Unlike the old motorised infantry regiments in the 1941 tank divisions, this formation contained a reasonable amount of supporting formations, such as an AA battalion, mortar battalion and a light artillery battalion. The core of this brigade was its 3 motorised infantry battalions. The first Tank Corps also contained 2 tank brigades, which each possessed 2 tank battalions and a motorised infantry battalion. This was a very different structure to the old tank regiments of the tank division and allowed the brigade to operate independently if required. This was critical as cross-brigade combined arms operations were simply not viable at this point in time due to a lack of skilled officers and training. Starting with the First Corps in 1942, the corps were very quickly formed. This shows the Third Corps, which was dated July 1942. The first notable change here was the addition of corps assets, in this case an armoured car battalion. The tank brigades were also evolving. The old battalions contained a mix of heavy, medium and light tanks, which did not really work very well because the heavy tanks were too slow, the light tanks were in the middle and the medium tanks were probably the fastest cross country, so you couldn't keep the battalion together. The result was the light and medium tanks, it was decided that the light and medium tanks at least were separated. So the brigade now contained a light and medium tank battalion. The other change was the number of brigades had increased from 2 to 3. By December 1942, the support formations, in this case of the 6th Tank Corps, now included a rocket artillery battalion. This at least provided some indirect fire capability for the Corps. It should be noted that the tank corps were not all identical. As these developments occurred, one corps would get it first and the old one would have an old structure. So there was an enormous amount of variability, particularly in 1942, or this period, 1942 and early 1943. The motorised infantry brigade remained much the same. However, each of the battalions were beefed up with additional supporting formations. The same increase of combat capability also occurred with the 3 tank brigades. The structure remained the same, but additional brigade support assets were being provided, which increased the brigade's combat strength. While I'm breaking this video up into years, 1 chapter per year, the development of the Russian Tank Corps was so rapid, major changes were occurring really each month during this period. However, by the end of 1943, the corps structure had stabilised. The January 1943 official structure of the Tank Corps showed significant changes over the actual TO&E of the earlier tank corps I mentioned. Even compared with December 1942, I suspect this structure was not implemented until well after January, as this is an official structure, and I found it a little bit difficult to find any of the tank corps which followed the exact official structure. In this particular case, an AA battalion was ended under Corps Command. The Corps also now contained a number of supporting regiments, or complex regiments, the first being a mortar regiments, which consisted of 3 120mm mortar battalions. This continued to beef up the indirect fire capability of the Corps, which was a major issue with the early Russian tank corps. The Corps also contained a self-propelled regiment, which consisted of 2 76mm SP battalions and a 122mm SP battalion. All these self-propelled guns could be used as assault guns, possibly to overcome German fortified positions. The 76mm armed SP guns would also have been very effective tank destroyers. The mixed SP regiments were only a short-term affair, with this being quickly replaced with a 2-battalion regiment consisting of the same self-propelled vehicles. I need to provide a special drill down or special note about the Russian self-propelled battalions or regiments. While the Su-76 was based on an idea tried by the Russians earlier or before the war, the Su-122, Su-152, ISU-122 and ISU-152 were apparently based on the German Stug assault gun. According to some sources I have read, the Russians were impressed by the Stug 3 and used captured Stug 3 in their own army. The result was the Russians decided to create a Russian version based on the T-34 and the KV chassis, mounting the 122mm howitzer and then the 152mm howitzer. While the Russians did use these vehicles in an anti-tank role, it should be noted the Russians used everything they had in an anti-tank role, so this does not indicate their primary purpose. A 122 or 152mm HE shell was very effective at destroying strong points and infantry defences, which is probably what they were originally intended for. Coupled with this, the low profile and thick armour of the ISU variants in particular gave these vehicles the ability to get close to their targets before they blew them away. Because of this, these assets were used in a very special manner. While the Su-76s, or the 76mm SP guns, were always organised in battalions, the Su-122/152 and ISU-122/152 could also be organised into 2-battalion regiments. These regiments contained some motorised infantry, which I assume was provided because these vehicles were very susceptible to enemy infantry. If these regiments were ever used unsupported, they would be rather vulnerable, and this did occur in several cases, thus the supporting infantry. Instead of distributing these assets among the brigades, they were often used as an ad hoc tank regiment, which more often than not did not go well. In most cases, only a single battalion of these heavy self-propelled assault guns were attached to a corps, with no regimental structure included. The motorised infantry brigade remained much the same, however improved equipment and additional support formations did result in an additional increase in combat strength. The 3 tank brigades also remained much the same, although there was some very minor tweaking if you want to drill down into company and platoon level. This chart shows the 16th Tank Corps in May 1943, which would have been a typical corps which was involved in the Battle of Kursk. The Corps' support formations had grown, with an engineer battalion, a 76mm anti-tank battalion and a 45mm anti-tank battalion being added. We also see a 152mm assault gun battalion added. The rest of the Corps structure was unchanged, only minor equipment changes affecting anything. What is interesting is half the tanks the Russians fielded in the Tank Corps were light tanks during this period, during basically the Battle of Kursk. Moving forward to October 1943, this shows the 5th Tank Corps. Under Corps control, the self-propelled battalions had stabilised to 3, in this case a 76mm, a 122mm and a 152mm SP battalion, with no regimental structure. While I cannot be certain, I feel these formations were mainly focused on taking on fortified German positions, as well as acting as tank destroyers when applicable. The other change during October 1943 was the removal of the light tank battalions, and now each tank brigade consisted of 3 medium tank battalions. While I'm certain some battalions were still light, all the medium tank battalions were armed with the 76mm T-34 tank. As the Russians were increasingly facing Panther tanks, this must have been rather uncomfortable, but was certainly superior than possibly a 45mm armed light tank. However, what we are seeing here is a formation that was truly able to at least hold its own against the German panzer divisions, although the lack of indirect fire capability and lack of infantry to hold position were an issue, as well as possibly a lack of reconnaissance capability. For this chapter, we're going to be moving into 1944, which represents the final development stage of the Tank Corps. This shows the 29th Tank Corps in January 1944. The support formations remain much the same. However, some major changes in the subordinate battalions did occur. The motorcycle battalion was really beefed up, doubling in combat strength. The 152mm heavy self-propelled assault gun battalion was also increased in size. I suspect that was because these formations were being used so much in a single battalion form rather than a regimental structure, they had to be beefed up. A second 76mm light self-propelled battalion was added. The number of these formations varied a lot, and it was common to find heavy tank battalions or even heavy tank regiments in place of the self-propelled battalions or regiments. Otherwise, the other battalions remained much the same. The motorised infantry battalion remained unchanged. However, due to manpower issues, some manpower reduction did occur. The tank brigades also remained the same, but in this case additional support elements were added which increased the strength of the brigade as a whole. The infantry battalions did experience some manpower reduction. Russia in 1944 was beginning to run out of men. This shows the 18th Tank Corps in June 1944. The motorcycle battalion continued to be expanded and beefed up. I expect the Russians felt their reconnaissance capability was still lacking, and this constant addition of assets to this battalion was an attempt to resolve this issue. There was no changes in the mortar regiment or motor rifle brigade, although due to manpower issues some manpower levels did reduce. This manpower issues also affected the tank brigade, and the tank brigade suffered additional manpower reductions, resulting in brigade support assets suffering. The tank battalion was basically unchanged, and while they were using late T-34s, they were still mainly the T-34-76 medium tanks. We'll now move into the last year of the war, 1945, when we actually reached the pinnacle of the Russian Tank Corps development, and also a major improvement in the equipment, particularly the tank battalions, which occurred in this year. This shows the official Tank Corps structure, specifically January 1945, and does not actually reflect a specific Tank Corps. The core assets continue to be beefed up, with this in this case a heavy tank regiment replacing a self-propelled regiment. A IS-2 heavy tank regiment was probably fairly similar to a ISU 122 or ISU 152 self-propelled regiment. Thus, they, in some ways, were almost interchangeable. In 1945, the Tank Corps finally gets an artillery regiment, and while only 76mm guns, it did provide additional indirect fire capability, which could be considered as reasonably normal artillery support. There were no changes to the Motor Infantry Brigade, nor were there any changes to the Mortar Regiment. In 1945, the tank brigades were beginning to receive the T-34-85 in significant numbers, which did beef up the strength of the tank battalion significantly. The infantry battalions continued to suffer manpower shortages and continued to shrink. One aspect I found interesting in my video or research was the lack of any major improvement in the Russian tank battalion combat strength, at least according to the point system I'm using. For most of the war, the Russians used the T-34-76 in their tank battalions, and there's really little difference between a T-34-76A and a T-34-76F in terms of combat capability, and thus in terms of points value. The main Russian focus was reducing the cost of each T-34, or increasing the speed that you could actually produce a T-34, rather than improving its combat capability, because quite frankly, in June 1944, it was pretty much, or 41, it was pretty much the best tank out there, so why bother improving it? The Germans went down the same path with the Panzer IV in mid-1944. The result of this is the combat strength of the T-34-76 tank battalions remained much the same during the entire war. The only main change was the introduction of the T-34-85 in significant numbers in very late 1944. This did give the tank battalions a significant combat strength boost, but apart from this, there was little change between 1942 and late 1944. Russian tank corps development and its evolution occurred during a rather difficult time for Russia, as you could well imagine. The Russians could not afford the luxury of making a mistake, and after the tank divisions were destroyed, decided to start from scratch. They first decided to get the tank brigades right and started rebuilding the tank brigades as well as the motorised infantry brigades. Once they had achieved a workable formation, they combined them together to form the corps. While some development and changes occurred in the tank battalions, specifically in the move from a mixed battalion to a light and medium battalion, then to the final abandonment of the light battalion, and then the replacement of the T-34-76 with a much better T-34-85, this was comparatively minor in terms of combat strength impact if you compare it with, let's say, the Germans, the British, or even the US. The biggest changes occurred in the corps support formations. You can see an increased number of support formations being added to the tank corps between March 1942 and May 1945. In terms of the way these formations actually worked in the fields, the brigades more often than not operated as self-contained independent formations. Exchanging assets between brigades were not common. As corps assets increased, the brigades could expect more and more attached formations to achieve specific objectives. But even in this case, some of the corps level formations often operated independently under direct corps command. In some cases this made sense, such as the reconnaissance and artillery. In other cases this made no sense and generally didn't end very well, such as the self-propelled tank battalions. The Russian tank corps' biggest weakness was officer experience, or lack of officer experience, and a lack of trained men. The Germans were experiencing the same issues in 1945, so this problem was not reserved to the Russians alone, but it was an issue which the Russians never fully solved between 1941 and 1945. The Russians never achieved the level of combined operations and flexibility the Germans conducted between 1941 and 44, or the US between 43 and 45, and the British between 44 and 45. However, even with this limitation, the Russians had developed a system which worked for them, allowed them to defeat the highly skilled and experienced army. So something they did was most certainly correct. And so we come to an end of my part 18 of my video series on the Russian tank corps in World War II, with a focus on the structure down to battalion level. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.